Like Lisa, I'm a philosopher of science, so when I was thinking about this topic, I thought I would just reflect a little bit on what a philosopher of science, like myself, would think when we think about complexity. So it occurred to me that there's basically two different types of contrasts that philosophers would have in mind when they think about complexity. First, one might contrast complexity with reductionism, so that a complex phenomenon is one that cannot be reduced to its constituent parts. In philosophy of biology, which is where I work, there's been a lot of discussion of this topic, in part because if biological phenomena are complex in this way, then biology can exist as an autonomous discipline that could not be reduced to physics or chemistry, as the positivists in the early part of the 20th century hoped it would. Classically, philosophers of science have considered reductionism as a logical relation, so that you take the central terms of your theories and you see how they're logically related, and if there's a way of reducing the concepts to simpler theories. So this is the first sense, which is a contrast with reductionism. There's a second sense too, though, that I'd also like to talk a little bit about, and this contrasts complexity with simplicity. And as I was going to say, this is a long tradition going back to at least William Ockham, but I guess I should say back to the pre-Socratics, that there's a role for simplicity and what you might call proper inference, or what we today might call scientific methodology. As I'm sure many of you know, Occam's razor prescribes that if one is to choose between two hypotheses, then the simplest of the two is to be preferred. The famous translation of his work is, quote, "Entities must not be multiplied beyond necessity." So for Occam, simplicity means something like the smallest number of different kinds of things postulated by a theory. Isaac Newton picked up on this, and in his Principia Mathematica of 1687, has his first rule of philosophy, or what he calls the rules of reasoning in philosophy. His first rule is the following. We are to admit no more causes of natural things than are both true and sufficient to explain their appearances. Now, Newton only has one sentence of justification of this rule, and he says, quote, "To this purpose, the philosophers say that nature does nothing in vain, and more is in vain when less will serve. And this is what I like the best. For nature is pleased with simplicity and affects not the pomp of superfluous causes." Likewise, Einstein is quoted to have said, "Everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler." Although I think you can keep these separate, and a lot of philosophers of science try to keep aesthetics and scientific methodology separate, they're often connected. And so what's often connected is something like the correct balance between complexity and simplicity and beauty, right? So judgments of beauty will be based on some sort of harmonious relationship between simplicity and complexity. I think my colleague's going to talk about this in art and music more directly, but I think it does happen in science too. Thomas Kuhn, the famous historian of science, who is now read by all freshmen here at Stevens, was right, I think, when he claimed that one thing a young PhD learns when she is inculcated into the scientific community is what counts as a beautiful theory or a pretty theory. Kuhn himself thought of this aesthetic sense as a progressive force in theory change. To use his famous case study, the Copernican theory of astronomy might not lead to more accurate predictions than the Ptolemaic theory, at least in the beginning, but it was aesthetically to be preferred, and the reason that the first astronomers jumped ship from a geocentric to a heliocentric worldview. So in other words, it was the aesthetic dimensions of Copernican theory which was made it pleasing and preferable, at least in the very beginning. So Kuhn's view is that during a paradigm shift these aesthetic factors come into play. And so people are driven not by the data necessarily, but just by a sense of what's aesthetically pleasing. There's other philosophers who think that aesthetics should be thought of as a conservative force. So for Kuhn, it's a progressive force. It's pushing science forward. For a philosopher that you might not have heard of called James McAllister, he thinks of it as a conservative force. So for him, beauty is going to be tied up with what our most successful theories in the past have been like. So judgments of beauty will be when you find a new explanation which matches something that has been used in the past in an analogical sense, and the past theory was successful. So if Newtonian theory is successful for hundreds of years, say, then we tend to think of things that look Newtonian as being beautiful. McAllister also thought that because the way in which beauty can change its meaning over time, it can also be a sign of truth. So that some of aesthetic judgments actually can ground belief. So there's some contemporary physicists, for example, Brian Greene, who writes on string theory, who says pretty much the same thing, that because there's not a lot of empirical support for string theory, we're just going to have to rely on our aesthetic intuition to work out what theories we should believe and which theories we should pursue. Okay. So just to give a quick case study, on McAllister's view, the reluctance of physicists to endorse the new quantum mechanics in the 1920s was mostly an aesthetic fear. They didn't like the aesthetics of the theory. It wasn't about how well the theory matched the data. And just to finish, I'd like to say a little bit about my own views, which contrast with these earlier views. I think that there's ways in which Occam and Newton and McAllister and Kuhn get things wrong. So they get a lot of things right, but you want to try and see how we can improve on what they've said. I think that what might disagree with Newton and Occam is that they tend to think of the principle of simplicity as apparent a priori. So this is a principle of science and the way we do our science that's independent of how the world actually is. So the world could be completely different, but our scientific methodology would be the same on this view. I tend to think that our rules of our heuristics and what we would call the scientific method is going to depend on how the world is actually structured. And different possible worlds would have different methodology. I'm also suspicious of the view that beauty, or even a particular balance between beauty and complexity, is a sign of truth. Or at least it's not a sign of truth that's apparent a priori before we actually investigate the world. Does this mean that aesthetics play no role in proper scientific methodology? No, not at all. I think one way of thinking about this, and as we think about what research we want to pursue, we can think of it from the point of view of decision theory. So in decision theory, we have two different sorts of variables that we're interested in. The probabilities that our models are going to be successful, and then also the utility that they're going to have if they are successful. And while beauty might not track truth, so it might not influence the probabilities of theories or models, it can influence the utility that they have. So here I think is where actually the role of aesthetics is most apparent in the way in which we appreciate the theories. So my view is that there's a role for complexity and beauty in guiding science, but it's not a sign of truth, not at least in any a priori sense, but rather to do with the way in which we view the practical significance of our theories. So it's quite likely that our most beautiful theories will also be the most practical ones. Okay. Thank you.